Try it a little bit closer. Thank you so much for coming out on this lovely, snowy Minnesota night and for braving the snow and the elements. My name is Tom Steinmetz, and I'm the CEO here at Washburn. And I'm really grateful that you've joined us tonight for this session with the renowned speaker and researcher, Dr. Gunnar. We've named this series our Let's Talk series because our hope and the intention of this is to bring people together from the community to have dialogue and increase knowledge and awareness about children's mental health and child development. And this is our second community seminar in this new 4-part series that we're doing this year. And to have Dr. Gunnar here with us tonight to share her expertise on resilience and healthy development in children is a natural fit both with the goal of this series and with the mission of Washburn Center for Children. So we see the real-life impact of early adverse experiences and of families' incredible resilience here at Washburn Center every single day. And we know that when children experience stressful or traumatic events, it impacts everything about their development. It impacts how they feel and respond to the world emotionally. It impacts how they perceive and think about and understand the world. It affects their relationships with their parents, their friends, and their teachers, and it affects their behavior. And we know that these experiences can literally change how a child's brain develops, and that's what we're going to hear more about tonight. So children, and as we're increasingly beginning to understand, even adults also have remarkable capacity to heal. And new experiences and relationships are the key to affecting that change. There's a story that really demonstrates this that I want to share quickly before I introduce Dr. Gunnar. We work with a lot of young children at Washburn, starting even at birth. And recently in one of our preschool therapeutic groups, a 4-year-old girl came to us who had experienced a number of stressful and traumatic events in her life. And the way that she had responded to this was she had become selectively mute. And that means exactly what it says. There were situations and environments where she simply did not talk. And when she came to Washburn and joined the group, she was silent and said almost nothing for close to the first 3 months that she was here. So our therapeutic work with her involved creating a safe, trusting, nurturing relationship and helping her to understand how her experiences had affected her emotionally and affected how she perceived and thought about the world. Over time, after those 3 months, we're talking about a 4-year-old girl, she gradually started to speak a little bit, first a little bit, and then more and more over time. She went on to make remarkable progress. She graduated from our therapeutic preschool program and moved into kindergarten. So our therapist followed up with her after she had graduated and started school and checked in with her kindergarten teacher. And they said, you know, how's she doing now? How's it going in kindergarten? Mm-hmm. And her kindergarten teacher said, you know, she's doing really well, but she's a little bit talkative. She needs to just learn how to.
That's great.
So she literally, through therapeutic work, found her voice. And with that, I'm really delighted to welcome and introduce our renowned guest tonight, Dr. Gunnar. Dr. Gunnar is the Regents Professor and Distinguished McKnight University Professor and the Director and Chair of the Institute for Child Development at the University of Minnesota, where she has taught students for more than 3 decades. She's a founding member of the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. And Dr. Gunnar has literally spent her entire career studying how stress affects brain development and the processes that can help children learn how to cope with stress. Her research has not only informed the field, it's impacted how we work with and understand young children's brain development. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gunnar. She's going to speak for about an hour. And then depending on your generation, I'm going to do the Phil Donahue, Oprah, or Ellen thing and go around with the microphone. We really want this to be a conversation, a dialogue. We want to actually talk and hear from you. So we will have time for question, discussion after she finishes up. But with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Megan Gunnar.
Thank you very much. Oh, these kind people got me something to lean against because in the snow, many of you probably have experienced, I fell down yesterday and I really banged my knee, so it's aching. So I'm going to try and do this. Can you all see me pretty well? That's much better. Get off that leg. It's really an honor to be here. This is such a wonderful place. It does such critically important work. So I am just delighted that I get a chance to come and share some of this information with you and to have a question and answer period with you afterwards. The information that I'm bringing you today is part of the work that I've been doing with the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. That's a group of researchers from neuroscience, child development, and so on that are working out of the Harvard Center for the Developing Child to look at all the information that we have on early development and then to argue, we argue a lot, until we agree that this actually is what is a valid thing to be transmitting to the public. And then we work with a group called Frameworks Institute that are communications experts to help develop the right kind of metaphors to carry that information across the gap from what science knows to what mostly policy makers will now understand and hopefully be able to understand enough to be able to decide on policies and practices. So this information is not just my information. This is what we've argued out for years and have come to decide that really it is about solid information about early development as we can get. We're all here tonight. You guys are a part of Washburn because you believe that a healthy development of a child is the basic pillars upon which we are going to develop a successful society. You need healthy child development to get educational achievement, economic productivity, responsible citizenship, and we're increasingly understanding how lifelong health is shaped and influenced early in life. These are the pillars, of course, of strong communities, a healthy economy, and the successful parenting of the next generation. We understand now so much of what we're dealing with is 2- and 3-generational. So by supporting what goes on here at Washburn, you're helping, it's not just the kids are really important, but we're really building towards a successful society and our grandchildren's and great-grandchildren's future. Now, what does it take to develop a healthy brain? Well, it helps to have good genes. Clearly, I got the good genes of my family, right? It helps to have good genes, but that isn't enough. In fact, we are increasingly finding that genes that vary a lot in the population are often good genes in one context and increased disorder in others. So there are genes that influence disorder, but like the gene that gives rise to phenylketonuria, for example, which is a single gene disorder. But for many of the genes that vary in our population, what really matters is the context in which those genes are developing. Right. But we also understand, too, increasingly that it takes this right supportive experiences. And there's a whole area of science that's developing now called epigenetics, which many of you probably have heard about, that is helping us understand how experiences literally write on our genes and regulate the way our genes act and get expressed. So let me show you a few cartoons to show you how this works. So let's imagine that we're looking at this child's brain. That's actually apparently people leaving the parking garage. And we're going to pull a neuron out of that so we can look more carefully at it. And this neuron has in its center a nucleus. And you all know that in the nucleus is where we have the chromosomes. And on the chromosomes are going to be the DNA, and on the DNA there are elements or periods, things that are called genes, right? You're with me. Those blue things, by the way, are proteins, they're histones, and our DNA is very long. We wrap it up really tightly and stick it inside the nucleus, and much of the trick of whether genes can be expressed is whether they are open to being talked to by chemical messengers. There are regions at the beginning of genes called promoter regions, and those promoters get information from the environment of the cell, and that causes them to either, say, transcribe that gene, make that protein, or not. And if they're all too tightly bound up, sort of glued shut, you can't talk to that gene, and that gene won't produce its effect. Now, much of this happens during the time from conception to birth, because we start out as a single-celled organism. You all know that no matter what cell I take out of your body, it will have the same DNA in it, pretty much, right? And obviously, your genes are not operating the same way in your heart, your liver, your blood cells, etc., because you're making different proteins there. You've got different cells. So much of this epigenetic change happens before birth, and it has to do with making different kinds of cells. But as we're beginning to discover, it continues post-birth, and it is part of how we become adapted to the environment in which we're developing. Okay? So how is that happening? You're getting messages to your neurons here. Hello, please messages. External experience. It causes a production of a bunch of regulatory proteins. Those interact with the DNA, and they lay down methyl marks. Those are the ones that actually are more permanent along your DNA, and that helps to glue shut some of the genes that are being talked to. How important is this? Well, let me give you an example. This example comes from work with non-human primates. I should tell you that epigenetic changes tend to be tissue specific. So your genes are regulated in your brain differently than they're regulated in your mouth or in your blood or in your liver. So here what they've done, so you sort of would like to look at brain tissue if you're interested in brain changes. These are 8 monkeys. 4 of them were reared with their moms, and 4 were reared on cloth surrogates. They were the Harry Harlow kind of baby monkeys. When they were about 6 months of age, they were sacrificed, and a piece of the prefrontal cortex was taken out. And they looked at the epigenetic changes, the number of methyl marks, on the promoter regions of 1,373 genes that were in this region of the prefrontal cortex. Does that make sense? Now, this is what's called a heat map. So the redder it is, the more methylation. The greener it is, the less methylation. Okay, methylation or not is not necessarily good or bad. You're regulating genes differently. And you don't really need statistics. You can see that the 4 baby monkeys that were reared with its mother had their genes regulated almost diametrically opposite of the baby monkeys that were reared on the cloth surrogate. The brain was being, and the genes in the brain were being regulated differently, adapting that baby to living without a mother or with a mother. Does that make sense? It's pretty profound. Now, this can change across development. These monkeys, of course, they didn't follow up because they were sacrificed. But if you look later at development, you begin to see some of these changes going away and different kinds of adaptation happening. But for the moment, at least, the brains have become completely adapted genetically to the environment in which the baby's developing. And there's every reason to suspect that's happening with humans as well. Okay. We are beginning to realize that much of this, of course, happens before birth. Even the part that isn't about determining what cells you have, but adapting your body to the world outside the womb. What experiences the mother has, what she eats, how stressed she is being communicated to her fetus, not because nature hates us. When things happen in a particular way repeatedly across individuals, it's because this has been selected across evolution to increase survival. So babies that experience prenatal stress are adapted to a harsher environment. Their bodies get set up to be able to gobble up whatever nutrients are around. They are at risk for cardiovascular disease because they're at risk for developing obesity later, because they're so good at scavenging calories. And they also seem to be increased in fearfulness, perhaps because they're more sensitive to nuances in the environment, perhaps as part of adaptation. So it begins early. First message is, pregnant women should have a life of Riley. No, we should be worrying about how much stress our pregnant moms are undergoing and how much anxiety and worry and fear and so on. A happy mommy makes a happy baby. Another way of talking about how important experience is, many of you have seen these slides. It's some kind of presentation or other. These are old slides, but they're still it's still very true. So if these come sadly from babies who have died and they've been able to look at brain tissue. So this is a slice out of the prefrontal cortex of a baby who died at birth, and it's been put under an electron microscope, and the neurons, that's what you're seeing here, have been drawn. Now, prefrontal cortex is what you use for thinking, reasoning, planning, doing algebra, etc. Babies, newborns, flash, are not really good at this stuff. In order for nerves to do anything, they have to talk to one another. And as you can see, in this part of the brain, they're not really connected up. They don't have any work to do at that point. You're doing the algebra for them, right? You're doing the planning for them. But under genetic control, there's a timetable, and boom, at a certain age, all of a sudden there's a proliferation of connections. The genes trigger this. Boom, you're all connected. Every neuron's connected to every other neuron. Right? That's not terribly efficient because this nerve sends a signal and everybody reacts, right? What's going to happen over time, though, is if this sends a signal and this is the right one and this goes and there's an effective response, it'll get confirmed, and pretty soon you'll drop away the connections that are not doing the work of your thinking, and you'll retain the ones that are. A way to think about it is the brain becomes what the brain thinks about. It's a brilliant, brilliant idea of nature, right? So we get good at thinking about what we think about. And if I grow up in one kind of environment and I'm thinking about all these things, I'll become really good at thinking about these things. If I'm not thinking about the stuff in the other environment, I won't be very good at that because I haven't trained my brain that way. And it's a very efficient system because it's easier to prune than to develop. Now, we continue to make connections as we learn throughout life. It's a more challenging way of doing it, but we do it. Those of us who are a little bit older would probably like to be doing that, but good ways are not necessarily doing those stupid brain games. But go out and decide to learn a foreign language and then go to that foreign country and practice and be immersed, and your brain will develop those connections. It'd be a lot easier to do that. In fact, you do it with your grandchild, and your grandchild speaking the language like a native, and you're still having to look up words, right? But you'll get there. This process of overproducing and then pruning is an extremely effective way to set the brain up. But the brain has other ways of doing it, and you can keep learning throughout your lifespan. And of course, the more you think, the more you can think. The more you learn, the more you can learn. So that's just for my aging friends. Keep thinking, keep learning. Now, the way the brain does this proliferation and pruning, we really see it sort of moving from the back to the front. And we're setting up different neural systems. And any of you who know babies will be able to recapitulate this. The first things babies get good at is seeing and hearing and coordinating seeing and hearing. And then they begin to get good at getting some of their motor activity together with their seeing and hearing. And then they're beginning to get good at the regions that have to do with language are coming in and so on. And then the beautiful prefrontal cortex that is the most mature and developed in us, right, is what we use a lot. That is developing, beginning in the first year, but it doesn't complete its development. Actually, we now know until about age 25. The gray matter gets done, and then we're still wrapping it with myelin up until about age 24, and then it's all downhill after that, right? So this is happening from the back to the front. But we never think about anything with just one part of our brain. So as we set up the foundation, our hearing and our vision and our motor coordination is creating opportunities for language development, and language development is creating opportunities for thinking about higher order things, and skills beget skills. The basic foundation of so much of this, though, is happening in those first few years of life, right? It's not that it's all over if you don't get in there, but we have this tremendous opportunity to help children develop in a healthy way if we can get the early years, get them started right, rather than having to get them back on track. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you stimulation is needed in order to develop a healthy brain. Brain architecture depends on the brain being able to think and process information. And then you have to ask, what in heaven's name was nature thinking of? Because humans are among the most helpless mammals on the planet. A newborn baby doesn't see very well beyond about 5-6 inches, cannot get its hand to its mouth, can't roll over, can't lift its head up, can't provide the stimulation that he or she needs to develop a healthy brain on their own. This, by the way, is why neglect is as serious, if not even more serious, a form of child maltreatment as physical and sexual abuse. Children's brains need stimulation. Now, what nature was thinking is brains are designed to develop in the context of relationships. In relationships, babies get plenty of stimulation. In fact, babies run entire households, right? I mean, they are far from helpless. Nature gave them a cry. That cry is really effective. And with people who are able to respond to that baby, you've got dads and moms and grandparents and brothers and sisters and later peers and teachers, and there's just loads of stimulation. It's about relationships. Relationships really can provide the context, do provide the context for healthy brain development. And we talk about the key component, the key part of relationships, in part, is this thing called what we have been calling serve and return to communicate with policymakers. Developmental psychologists, you guys call it interaction, but that doesn't communicate too well. We think of it as serve and return because when the baby's brain organizes a response, sends a signal, it's as if the baby's rolled a ball to us. And we respond, we roll the ball back. They serve it, we return it, then later we can serve it and they can figure that out if it's part of a dance they know, and they'll return it. And I don't know if you've ever played ball with a very young child. If you know that child well, you know that they tend to go off in that direction, and you can keep the game going for quite a while. If you don't know the child and don't know their signals, it's more of a struggle. It's about relationships. But in those relationships, literally, the brain's architecture is getting confirmed. I'm sending a signal. It's having an effect. That information comes back. Those nerve cells get fed better, etc. So the serve and return is the key ingredient to healthy brain development occurring in relationships. Okay? Now, this also suggests that the barriers to educational achievement, the education gap, the opportunity gap, starts early. These are old data. They're data from Hart and Risley in the early part of the 1990s. They sent research assistants into the homes of families who were either living in poverty and weren't very well educated, had high school educations, were part of the working class, or college educated. And they had them write down all the words that the baby was saying over an 8-hour period of time. They came back repeated times. No big surprise, before 16 months there wasn't much difference. Babies don't talk much. Between 16 and 24 months, we begin to see the emergence of a social class difference in the number of words that babies know. And by 36 months, there's your achievement gap. Now, why is that an achievement gap? As we learn words stand for concepts. The more words we have, the more concepts we have. The more concepts and words we have, the more we can think about stuff. And the brain is becoming what the brain thinks about. It has a better opportunity to think about a lot of stuff. Okay, skills are begetting skills. Now, this has been redone recently in a number of different ways. Some of you have heard of this tool called Lena. Lena collects all the language that's spoken around the child, and they have algorithms where they're able to look at whether it is language that the child is hearing or language that is being directed towards the child, okay? And this is work by Anne Fernald. What she did is she was working with 29 low-income Spanish-speaking families in Northern California. And when the children were, I believe, let me read it carefully, David has a home for a family, anyway, it was about 19 months of age. They were in there doing this. And she's just laid it out from the child that heard the least number of words to the ones that heard the most. And you can see there's a tremendous range here. From this child way over here is probably getting 50 words in conversation. The dark bus is the words with the child, and the lighter stuff is the words they're hearing around them. Could be on the radio or television as well. So this child way over here is hearing, I don't know, what does it look like to you? 100, 200 words a day? And this child over here is hearing about 10,000 words. They may be the same words, right? But there's a lot of conversation that's happening with that baby. Even in these low-income families, huge range. Does it matter? Well, what Anne did to try to find out if it mattered is she had a task where you sit the baby in front of a computer screen and you have an X. You try to get the baby's attention here. On one side of the computer screen is a picture of a dog. And on the other side is a picture of a cat. Or she had other things as well as dogs and cats. And once you've got the baby's attention here, you say, hey, look at the dog. Okay? And you're tracking the baby's eye movements. Okay? Now, you and I, because we know the words for dog and cat, hey, look at the duh, and we're looking at the dog. Right? Because we've already looked at the screen. We know there's a dog and a cat. And all we need to do is hear the duh. And we know it was a dog. Right? So what she found was in these children, those who were getting the top number of words in that whole group, it's Spanish, so it's Mira el Perro, they're listening along. The P is here. These are microseconds, so it's fast. These guys, their eyes are moving much earlier and they're processing, it means they're processing the language more quickly. They've got it. Now, the interesting thing about language is, although where we talk to babies, we say, look at the dog, isn't it a cute dog, right? We slow things down, we use what's called motherese. But still, words are coming at us in sentences. So one word and the next, and pretty soon you don't know, you've been in a foreign language, and you're like, please speak more slowly. If you speak more slowly, I'll understand what you're saying. But I don't have this set up so I can process language coming at me quickly. But the more language you're part of, even before you can say the words, they're processing it faster. Does that make sense? So, skills beget skills. Language is concepts. Concepts are what we use to think. Now, excuse me. I don't want this to spook you all. The brain continues to develop after age 3. These things aren't written in stone, but they do tell us what kids are going to have available at certain points. So this is Jamie Hansen's work when he was at the University of Wisconsin. These kids are from Milwaukee. He collected a group of kids who were low, middle, and high socioeconomic class. And he began imaging the brains when they were around 5 months of age. Here we're looking at gray matter volume, total gray matter volume, and if you know Perot, these are the little gray cells, right? This is what you think with. There's also white matter that helps speed up the transmission of information, but here he's looking at gray matter volume. As you make more connections, that volume increases. As you prune them back, the volume is smaller, so it's probably not the number of cells, but the degree of connections that have been organized and are retained. And what you see, these are growth curves, is that early on there's no difference in brain volume, but by the time we get to 3 years of age, children from higher socioeconomic families simply have more brain architecture than children who are growing up in poverty. Now, as they go to school, this is likely going to change. But everything I've shown you says by age 3, we're doing catch-up. Right? The children go in with, I mean, we've already got them in a place where they're going to struggle to have to catch up. And we're going to have to spend more time and energy. So the big message from, of course, this part of this, let's get in early. Let's make sure. This is why the push for Art Rolnick and others is let's get in early and let's stop the achievement gap before it emerges. And then we can move on. But we don't quit on any kid, okay? What's going into some of this? I've been talking about stimulation, but it's not just stimulation that's the issue. This is a study that looked at brain volume for the hippocampus, which is the part that is really important for specific learning and memory retention. And they looked at the level of income to need. So higher income to needs, you're wealthier, in kids who were 3 to 5 years of age. And I'm trying to show you positive correlations in green and negative ones in red. No surprise. The kids who were in wealthier families had parents who were better educated. But that doesn't have a connection to brain volume when you put the rest of these things in. The kids who come from wealthier families have parents who use less harsh discipline and more constructive and warm discipline. I.e., the parents are not so stressed that they're not yelling at their kids. Right? And that does matter. So the quality of parenting is positive, higher quality parenting, positively associated with larger brain volume. And the kids who are coming from wealthier families have less stress. And stress exposures are, the more stress exposures, the smaller the brain volume. So it's both stress and stimulation, is what this is saying. So now we're going to shift into the part of my talk where I talk about stress, which is what I do. I live it, I study it. Oh, once you put all those things in, there's no connection between poverty and brain volume. So it's operating through things that are malleable and changeable, and that we could do a better job as a society to support families, and that would change. So when we talk about stress, I want to make sure you all realize that you should not run home and worry about every horrible, stressful thing that you ever let your kid experience, and every tantrum that they had, and every time that you went home so stressed that you didn't do exactly the right thing, because they're pretty forgiving. Also, it's really good to experience some stress in life. Activate that biology of stress, learn that you can deal with it, and you can turn it off. This is what we think of as positive stress experiences. Decide you want to ride a bike, try to ride it, get frustrated as everything because you keep falling down, and keep at it and keep at it and keep at it till you're bloody and blue. And you learn how to do it, and yay! You've learned that you can manage things. This is good stuff. We talk about some stress is tolerable. These are often very serious things that happen to children, being in a car accident, losing a parent, and so on. But what makes it tolerable is you're activating your stress biology, but there are people around you, there are relationships that you have around you that are helping you regulate it. And over time, you may come out of it just fine. And in fact, you may also learn that you're tough. What we worry about is toxic stress. And this is not a scientific term. It's used to communicate. This is what happens when you get activation of stress biology for prolonged periods of time. Typically, this only happens when you don't have supportive, secure relationship partners that are helping you regulate, or where those people that you need to rely on are actually the sources of the anxiety and fear, which is the worst context. So toxic stress is what we worry about, and we worry about it for a number of reasons. First of all, we know that experiences early in life, at least from the animal work that's out there, will actually regulate and change the way your stress system functions. This is work that's being done with rats and mice. If you study rats and mice and you look at rat mommies, there are some things that they need to do to provide high quality care. They need to lick the behinds of their babies so that they pee, and they need to arch their back so the baby can get to the nipples. Now, if you look across a whole colony of rats and you track them over litters, you'll find that you have some moms that are really high. They arch their back really nicely. They lick and groom a lot. And then you have some moms on the other end that tend litter after litter to start flop on their sides. Come and get it, kids. Lick them only the minimal amount. And you can identify those that are really high care and low care moms. Making sense? Now, you follow their pups up, and as they get to be adults, you do things to activate their stress biology. One thing that they use a lot is you put them in a restraint tube, as if, you know, for a rat, in a sense, you're crawling through a tunnel that you've made and it's collapsed on you. And it really activates a nice stress response. And what you see is the offspring of the high care moms will produce a nice stress response, and then when it's over, and they turn it off. But you have these low care moms, and when you follow their offspring up, they produce a larger stress response that takes longer to turn off. And this is a function of epigenetic changes, okay? What's interesting here is you can cross-foster rats. A rat mommy is very stimulus-driven, so as long as it looks and smells like the age of the pup it's supposed to be, she'll nurture it. You can cross-foster them at birth, and they follow the experience. This is not a gene-driven thing. This is an experience-driven thing. And in rats, at least, it will track to the next generation. So one of the other parts of the body that's altered is if you're a female pup growing up with that kind of a mom, with these moms, your estrogen receptor gets altered. And since pups are so stimulus-driven, rats are, they will tend to follow. If they were raised by a low-care mom, they'll become a low-care mom. Does that make sense? We are different, guys. There's a lot more that goes into our mothering than just whether, and nobody was licking and grooming our butts. I mean, so got to have a little translation there. But nonetheless, this is a lot of what we're studying now, is how do those early experiences shape and alter the stress system? And and this is my own work, I do know that in children who are neglected and maltreated, children who grow up in orphanages, or those who are maltreated and are in foster care, a larger percent of them have altered patterns of stress system functioning. Okay, and that predicts attention problems and externalizing behaviors. And that lasts for years after they get out of the orphanage. So it's an early experience induced, though there may be some opportunities to change it at adolescence. Okay, this is hot off the presses data. You're the second audience to hear this. I gave a talk to the Interfaith Action Coalition over in St. Paul earlier this week. And so they saw it they were the first guys, but you're the second. One of the things that I study is how important a secure attachment relationship is in buffering stress responses for children. Kids can go through a lot as long as they're with someone that they have a secure attachment with. That provides a powerful buffer. So one of the things I've been doing with Children's Hospital St. Paul or Children's Hospitals and Clinics, and we've been working in one of the St. Paul clinics, is we've been tracking children when they come in for their well baby exam with their shot, and when the kids are in their second year of life. So 12, there's a shot and exam at 12, 15, and 18 months. And the clinic we're working in has a full range of people from about 50% of the families there are below 150% of the poverty index. So they're poor or near poor. And then they have some families that go up to, over $200,000 a year and so on. And we've been following them, taking saliva samples to measure stress hormones when they arrive and after their doctor's exam, and then 20 minutes after the shot. And the shot, as you can see, activates stress biology. That's fine. But what we're seeing is that for the kids above, who are growing up in relatively high-income families, it doesn't really matter in this exam context whether they're securely or insecurely attached to the parent. But for the kids growing up in poverty, it makes an enormous difference. So what we're seeing is that the kids growing up in poverty who have secure attachment relationships, they're not showing elevated hormones, stress hormones. They're showing a really nice pattern. They come to the clinic, and then, I'm playing with the nice doctor and nurses, and they're doing all sorts of cool doctor-nurse things and talking sweet. And I go down, and then you give me a shot. I don't like that, and I activate, right? But for the ones who are growing up without that security, you see they come in, they're high, and they stay high. They don't react positively to the doctors, nurses, and they show the response to the shot. So this is some of the earliest evidence that attachment security is buffering kids' stress biology from the experience of growing up very poor. Yes?
How do you define security and insecurity?
Okay, yeah. So There are two ways, there are multiple ways to do it. There's something, the gold standard has been the strange situation. Bring them into the lab. It's a series of parent coming and going and strangers and so on. This we did with something called the attachment cue sort. So it's a description, 100 things describing kid behavior in relation to their caregiver. And you observe and you sort them into piles of 9. So 9, 9, 9, 9, 9. Now, each of those has a value assigned to it, and there have been what are called criterion sorts done. So what would the securely attached child look like? What would the, and the more highly correlated the sort you had on that kid is with the criterion sort, the closer to 1, the more securely attached the kid's behavior. So what the child is really showing you is the extent to which they can use that adult as a secure base in that context, right? And that they're leaning towards going to and becoming comforted by that adult. So that's what we did. So yeah, attachment security, relationship security, good serve and return is buffering kids' biology from even those that are growing up in really poor households with all the stresses that go along with that. Of course, it takes an amazing parent to manage to be responsive and provide that. The percentage of families where the babies are secure goes down as you go deeper into poverty. No surprise, right? Put me in those contexts, I bet my kid would be insecurely attached because it's really hard to be sensitive and responsive 24/7 to a baby. Okay, so what does all this do to the brain? We're going to talk about 3 parts. And I always like to remind people that, in fact, your brain is not color-coded like this. It wouldn't look like this if you looked inside. This little green thing is your hippocampus. You have one on either side of your head. And you have 2 amygdalae. So that's your amygdala. The hippocampus is important for memory and learning. The amygdala is important for all sorts of things that have to do with emotion, but also very important for fear learning. And the prefrontal cortex is where we do our higher order, really amazingly humanly competent planning, self-regulation, etc. Okay? So we're going to look at all of these parts of the brain. Toxic stress changes brain architecture. This is work, this particular bit that I'm going to be showing you comes from research with animals where they're able to actually take the cells out of the brain and put them in a petri dish and dump stress hormone on top of them. Okay? So this is really, we know, causal. And what's on top there, that's a normal cell, and this is a cell that's been exposed chronically to stress hormone. Now, these cells could be either in the prefrontal cortex or in the hippocampus. We see very similar effects in those 2 regions. Now, if we look on all those connections, those little knobby things that are on there, those are your synapses. And what you can see is not only there are fewer connections, but there are fewer synapses on those connections. What's biology doing? What's happening is these stress hormones actually run a neuron really, really hard, and they don't allow it to take up as much sugars. And so what happens, it's like you're driving the neuron to the edge of a cliff, and it can literally burn itself up. So the neuron doesn't want to die. The neuron wants to live. One way to live is to pull back the stuff that will actually absorb that stress hormone. Does that make sense? So it's pulling back to try to protect itself from chronic stress. Meanwhile, of course, it's pulling back. It's not able to function as well. And for those of you who have ever lived through a period of really intense high stress, many of you have probably experienced the fact that you just can't seem to think. I can't think like I used to be able to think, right? I mean, my brain is just not cooking on all 4 burners here. But after the stress is over, and maybe you've had a chance for a vacation, and you've recovered and whatever, your brain comes back, right? It may have taken a hit, but largely comes back. And that's what happens here as well, except when you're young and your brain is developing, it's trying to develop on top of these impacts. Does that make sense? So we see longer-term effects for little kids. Now, if this was the amygdala, we'd see the reverse. So chronic stress on the amygdala increases its connectivity. So what's nature doing? I'll answer your question in a sec. It seems what's happening is the system is getting biased towards being able to learn fear really well and to kick in defensive responses and pull off these thinking and reasoning parts of the brain, right? To bias it towards an act now, think later kind of brain, which may be really, really useful. If you're growing up in a really dangerous environment, we're sitting around and saying, gee, I wonder if that was a gunshot. It's just not the good thing to do, right? Run and hide, right? Yes, somebody had their hand up.
Yeah, at what age are children able to go through that stress mechanism and recuperate like us adults would be able to do?
Adulthood.
Just only adulthood? I mean,
It depends on what part of the brain.
big stress moment.
What?
I mean, there's children out there in society who go through those big stress
Yep.
moments and stuff. I just want to know if there's a certain age bracket where they can cope with that mechanism more than another age.
Depends on how frightened they are, right? During that stress, it's fear. A lot of it is how fearful, how anxious, how you'll see more data as we're coming along. A lot of what I'm going to tell you is pretty depressing, except that it's not over till it's over. And even if regions of the brain are being affected, we have other regions that can develop and compensate for them, right? Maybe I'll tell the story now. I like to tell the story of my colleague who is now at Harvard. I'm at Harvard. I know you're at Harvard. But he had a cardiovascular, he had heart defect at birth, and your hippocampus is really sensitive. It needs a lot of oxygen. So kids who have heart defects oftentimes have the hippocampus deprived of oxygen. And his hippocampus was clearly damaged. One of the things the hippocampus does, it helps you develop cognitive maps and find your way around the world. And never follow this guy if he says he knows where the restaurant is, because he doesn't. You know, he does not have that capacity, right? But he's at Harvard. And now he has GPS, so he really is in love with that lady in his car that tells him how to get from here to there, right? But still, never follow him unless he's got his GPS in hand when he says, I know where the restaurant is. So there's an instance where the hippocampus clearly was influenced, was affected, and the guy's a famous professor at Harvard. There's ways of working around these things, right? So it's not over till it's over. I'm turning now to the amygdala to show you that these are kids that were, these are adolescents who as young children were either in orphanages or were in child protective services. And what they've done is they've shown the children pictures of angry faces, fearful faces, happy faces, neutral faces, and they're imaging the brain, and they're looking at the amygdala and how much blood flow goes to the amygdala while you're processing angry faces, fearful faces, happy faces, or neutral faces. And what you're seeing is the ones here with the clear bars are the kids who are the ones who have been in orphanages or in child protective services, and the dark bars are the comparison. So what you're seeing is a bit of an effect here, but not much, but it's there for anger, and a very significant effect for fear. Our amygdala is really good at picking up fear in the faces of others and kicking us into a defensive mode. Really good at that. And you wonder why? Well, if we're a group organism, and if 3 or 4 people in our group suddenly start going, ah! You want to pay attention to that, right? And react because there's some danger there. So the amygdala is really good at that. But the kids who have had the adverse early experiences are exceptionally good at that. So it's not that their brains aren't good at stuff. Their brains are really good at sussing out what's dangerous and reacting to what's dangerous, because that's been important for their brains to learn. It increases their survival chances. But of course, it also may make it really difficult to operate in a context where you have to set your emotion aside and learn that 2 and 2 is 4, even though that's a really boring thing to learn. And you can get hijacked more easily by the teacher then looking at you with a cross-eyed because you didn't do it right, and suddenly you're in a defensive mode because you recognize there's some anger in the face of that teacher. She's trying not to express it to you, but you see it because you're good at that. It's one of the things you're really good at. Okay, so these are data from my own lab where we looked at children adopted from orphanages. We're looking at the hippocampus. The kids were adopted by, on average, age 2, though it went up to age 5. And we're looking at the volume of the hippocampus. You have a left and right hippocampus. These are our comparison kids. These are the ones adopted between 4 and 12 months. These are the ones adopted between 1 and 5 years. We're getting a dose-response relationship to the degree of deprivation years after they've gone into probably the most enriching and supportive environments that we can think of on the planet. Now, one thing I do know, though, is even though these kids here have smaller hippocampi than these kids here, they're just as good at solving problems that require the hippocampus. So they've lost perhaps some gray matter, but they're learning strategies that allow them to solve those problems, right? These kids are struggling with those problems, but that doesn't mean that we can't figure out how to teach them. They might do a lot better. Does that make sense? Okay. This is the prefrontal cortex. The poor prefrontal cortex, even though it develops forever, it starts early and it is very sensitive to early adversity. No surprise. We know a prefrontal cortex is important for attention regulation, self-regulation, emotion regulation, all of the things that kids who are coming up out of conditions of real adversity struggle with. These kids, so we didn't even see an early versus later adopted effect. Even 4 to 12 months we were seeing smaller. But again, the early adopted ones, smaller gray volume, but they're solving the problems that require the prefrontal cortex almost as well as our kids who were born and raised in well-educated families of well-educated, high-income people here. So they're learning to use what they got if they get out earlier, whereas the older ones are still, there's more going on here than just gray matter volume is what I'm telling you.
Maybe I'm reading that. Can you go back?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm reading that incorrectly, but it looks like the earlier adopted kids do less well.
So do you see those little bars that go up and down?
Yeah.
Okay, secret. Those are called error bars, standard error bars. If they overlap, there's nothing significantly different. So we could do it again and it would be a different pattern. So the only ones that overlap, they don't overlap with the kids who are Minnesota controls. Or what I used to call, though maybe I won't ever do it again, Garrison Keillor kids. Yeah, sad. Okay, one of the things my lab has been looking at is this regulation of stress hormones. And what we find is for these kids who come out of deprivation, even for the years later, they show this kind of pattern of dysregulated stress hormones. So these are my early deprived kids. Higher is more stress dysregulation. These are my Minnesota kids. They barely overlap. What does this predict? It predicts problems with ADHD and problems with peers, but mostly mediated by attention and executive function problems. So, okay. Was I going to do this? Don't remember. Oh yeah, I was going to do this. Okay. The other thing that is really beginning to be increasingly important is understanding how early experience influences immunity and lifelong health. So what we're seeing here is one of the things that stress should do is stress, hello, there we go, chronic stress or stress will begin to shift the emphasis between, we have a form of immunity called innate immunity. You don't have to, your cells don't have to learn anything, you don't need to be inoculated, you don't need to whatever. It's your cells are able to do this. It's your first line of defense. Inflammation is part of innate immunity. So if you get a wound, you will rush those white blood cells there. You don't have to learn to do that. Natural killer cells, macrophages, fever and sickness behavior, all of that is a component of innate immunity. And one of the things that chronic stress does is it biases us to more strong innate immunity response, and it can impair some of the learned immunity. So one of the things we're beginning to see is that individuals who experience chronic stress, especially those who experience it early in life, begin to develop an immune system that is as if they're chronically slightly sick. They run an increased level of inflammation all the time. Excuse me, that was supposed to be there. We first saw this, not me, but the field saw it in work that was done in a cohort study. That is, they studied all the kids born in Dunedin, New Zealand, and tracked them over time. They did many, many things in this study, but But one of the things they did as they got to young adulthood is they took blood samples and they analyzed the blood for the levels of C-reactive protein. Some of you older folks have gone to the doctor and they've measured this recently because we find if it's elevated, it's a predictor of cardiovascular disease. And fibrinogen, that's another part of wound healing. This is part of the innate immune system, white blood cells, and then they had a measure where they put them all together. They had been tracking these kids from 3 years of age. It was Dunedin, New Zealand. They knew a lot about these kids. They knew which ones had not had any evidence that they'd been maltreated. Since they'd observed interactions and had loads of data, they had ones where they said probable maltreatment, but had never risen to the level where they were involved with Child Protective Services, okay? So that's the no probable definite that you see there. And what you're seeing in all these measures is, especially the C-reactive protein, is higher levels of inflammation in the children who had experienced more adverse care, and this is before age 12. Okay? And now they're young adults. So they're walking around with, as if they're chronically slightly ill. And these guys weren't ill. They assessed that. Okay? This is work that was done in Wisconsin. And here they took saliva from the kids, and they challenged it with the herpes simplex virus. And they looked at the response. How much of the saliva actually was showing that they were shedding herpes simplex virus. Now, almost all of us, by the time we're adults, have been exposed to the herpes simplex virus. It's what gives you cold sores, right? But most of us contain it. When we're stressed, right? Like when we're going to defend our dissertation, that's when it gets out of control and we get that really ugly thing, right, that embarrasses us, right? But we mostly contain it. So they looked in these kids. These were kids who were non-maltreated, kids who were physically abused, and children adopted from orphanages. The kids are 11 years old. The orphanage adopted kids have been adopted by age 2. What we're seeing is less ability to control this herpes simplex virus. So we know that they were beginning to see kids running higher inflammation and less capacity to contain illness. Okay? So it's affecting our health on top of everything else. So what have I told you so far? And I've been yakking a long time. The architecture of the brain is shaped by our experiences. Experiences matter. Skills beget skills. Simple skills help us big later skills. Early foundation really matters a ton. Brain architecture develops in the context of relationships, supportive, warm, serve and return relationships. Boy, that's what we want for all kids if we could help support it. Toxic stress can literally shape an anxious, fearful brain that acts first and thinks later. The achievement and opportunity gap begins really early in life. And chronic stress early in life can affect lifelong health. I haven't told you all of those stories, but I hope you get it. So how do we act on our science? Well, get it right the first time. It's really the best idea if we can manage it as a society. Basic principles of neuroscience indicate that getting the conditions right early is going to be more effective and less costly, and the brain requires more physical energy to compensate for poorly formed early neural circuits. It's a higher cost to society. Washburn costs a lot of money, right? We want kids to be able to come here, but wouldn't it be nice if they didn't need you guys? And it would be certainly cheaper. So get it right the first time, but we are about repairing brains and relationships. And repairing stress and repairing brains really does mean remodeling relationships if we can do it. So we have a child here, and he's distressed and a mess. He's a hot mess, and we want to get him into this child that's confident, capable, and ready to learn. Well, that's going to take creating those therapeutic relationships and stopping the relationships that add, stopping repairing those relationships. That's really what we're talking about. Because those relationships create that incredible cycle, right? Where the child becomes more distressed, drives the adult crazy, the adults get more upset, drives the child, and on, and we want to interfere with those. Yeah?
Just a question on that one slide where the cold
Cold sore stuff, yeah.
Right, the cold sore stuff. The children that were in the adoptive were more susceptible, right, than the abused.
Well, actually, no. Got to look at those error bars again.
Okay, all right.
Okay, let's go back there. See the error bars?
Oh,
overlap?
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I was actually headed
those two
toward.
groups are different from the non-maltreated
Okay.
groups.
I was headed toward relationship, right? So, never mind.
No, but you're right. Those orphan adopted kids now have really good relationships, but something happened early that already instantiated this.
Okay.
So it's not about their current relationships.
So, is there a correlation between a negative relationship?
At that age?
Yeah. Like a physical abuse is a relationship, but it's negative.
Right. So it's quality, safety, secure relationships that we're after.
Okay.
Not just a relationship, right? And the early stuff sometimes is hard to repair, right? So here in this instance, they're probably going to be walking around, the ones with this, with a lifetime greater risk that when they get stressed, they're going to show a cold sore. The world won't come to an end, right? But maybe it will be more challenging. They may need to know that they're also at greater risk for cardiovascular disease. We're doing work right now looking at that for children who are adopted, having been growth stunted. And they aren't obese, but they are showing already by adolescence a stiffening of the arterial wall a bit and problems with insulin regulation. So that's okay. They don't have to develop cardiovascular disease, but they're going to need exercise, and they're going to need to be watching what they eat, and more than somebody else, right? There's always ways of getting around this. It's just, right, we need to know what we're up against. Okay, so I did this. Hello, 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 hello. Okay, next. And when you're working with children like this, even if you're the parent, it does involve therapeutic caregiving, right? Once this situation is set up, then my adoptive parents need help. They need families where this has happened may need our support to be able to get themselves out of it. And you all, working with children who have experienced all this, you don't want to be locked in your classroom all alone with those kids. You work together and provide each other with support, because it takes an incredible amount of energy and competence and your own stress reliefs to continue to manage to work with kids who have some of these challenges, because they need us to be calm and confident, right, and not to leak our frustration and anger at them because it's been a bad day for us. So what are the elements of therapeutic caregiving? Reading and responding to the child's signals, even when they're mixed. Big challenge. Strategies for regulating the child's behavior, supportive backup for the caregiver, additional resources to address specialized needs, and a careful planning for transition. These kids don't handle transitions well. Okay, last little tiny bit. Helping children build resilience. I mean, this is what we want to do for all of our kids. My colleague Ann Maston, who is brilliant, says it just takes ordinary, she's been studying this for years. They went into it thinking they would find some special something about those individuals that could be resilient. And the more they studied it, the more they found that what builds resilience is what builds healthy child development. It's ordinary magic. At least one high-quality relationship in the child's life. Good schools, good libraries, good synagogues and churches for a kid to be a part of, good safe neighborhoods. It's just ordinary magic. But one way to think about how we then develop resilience in kids that have experienced a lot of challenges is to think about it, it's complicated. It's like, think about it like a teeter-totter. So, if the teeter-totter is tipped in one direction, outcomes will be poor. And the more we add up negative adversity, the more we can tip that teeter-totter in that direction. But we can balance it with some of this ordinary magic, right? And maybe even be able to tip this thing into good outcomes with enough of, and that's what you're trying to do here at Washburn. You're trying to get in and work and build repair, but also these are protective factors. You're helping to provide, and protective strategies for the child. We know also, by the way, that there's a fulcrum for a teeter-totter. Go back there. And for many of us, we're born and the fulcrum is about in the middle. But some kids are born with the fulcrum to one side or to the other. If the fulcrum is way over to one side and you add just a little bit of diversity, they'll struggle. If it's all the way to the other, you can almost knock them on the head, and they manage to keep on ticking, right? But the experiences we have also begin to shift that fulcrum. As we build healthy brain architecture and add protective factors and work with children to repair and provide them with workarounds, we're helping to move that fulcrum along so that they become better capable of experiencing negative things without tipping the teeter-totter into poor outcomes. Does that make sense? So fulcrums, teeter-totters, protective, negative factors, there's a lot of things that go into resilience. But we can think of building resilient children in the entire state of Minnesota by thinking about how are we developing protective factors? What are we building into their experience? Are we providing really good schools? Are we providing safe neighborhoods? Are we making sure that they have access to a high-quality library? And on. We can help build ordinary magic and help offset some of the challenges that many of our kids experience. So, ding dong. So the recipe for resilient citizens: adequate stimulation and the appropriate stimulation for the development of healthy brain architecture from the beginning. Eliminate toxic stress if we can. Not all stress, just toxic stress. Increase support and protective factors for children and their families. But don't overprotect kids from the slings and arrows of life. Don't go crazy and wrap them in bubble wrap. So if you want more information, there's our CHD website for the Institute of Child Development, but the other is the Harvard Center, where we have loads of materials, videos, all sorts of things if you want to take things back to other communities and say, hey, I heard this interesting talk. You can get a lot of it there on the Harvard website as well. So now I think we've got a little time for questions, right?
Before we do that, can we say a very warm thank you to Dr. Gunnar? And who'd like to jump in with a question?
So the question is kind of all over the place right now because a lot of information is going through my head. Considering that the brain isn't fully developed until 25 years old.
Right.
And through a child's experience, with relationship being so critical in their brain architecture,
Yep.
how do you, for the caregivers out here, whether we're teachers or parents, adoptive parents, or whatever, what are the indicators you use to determine if you are making progress? I mean, we all believe, I think most of us believe, that things can change for that child that's in toxic stress. We've experienced it, we've seen it. It's often hard to determine what the indicators are. How do we know when we're making progress, if we're making progress outside of the therapists that do this on a daily basis? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
For us lay people out here who work with children day in and day out, what are some helpful hints or indicators that we can use to determine our own progress with that child?
Yeah, and sometimes it's slow, right? And sometimes the challenge is as you begin to break down the child's expectations for how things are. In other words, this kid expects that everybody will basically be mean to them and not support them. As you begin to threaten that worldview, right? We like to be able to predict things even if what we're predicting is negative, right? So I'm predicting that you aren't going to be there for me. And now you've begun to increasingly show me that you will. Well, that's sort of threatening. So you may see you're making progress because it gets worse a little bit. Right? Don't be dismayed, all right? If you're providing what you're pretty sure that kid needs and it gets a little worse, that may just be because you shook that kid's worldview up. And keeping going, I mean, what you really want to see is that they're beginning to turn to you when they need help, right? And that they're reducing you're not feeling as manipulated, right? Because they learn to be really good manipulators. But at the point where they seem to, so, I mean, you are not feeling as manipulated. Remember, your feelings are part of your Geiger counter of what's going on in these relationships. So if this kid is annoying the hell out of you and you're controlling yourself but then as you begin to say, you know, those days when Johnny doesn't come and you go, oh, good, Johnny's not here. Oh, I felt right. So the less you're saying, gee, Johnny's not here, it'll be a good day. You know, you may not even be able, I mean, I don't know, am I doing this at all right? I'm not a therapist. But the less it's draining for you to be working with that child probably is an indicator that that child is also beginning to trust you and turn to you. And you may not see it exactly. They may still be, you know, running down the halls when they're supposed to be walking and things like that, but you're not finding it as aversive because some good things are beginning to happen. Does that make sense? Anne, you're back there. Help me. Help me, Anne. There's our therapist. She will give you the right answer.
That's a lovely answer.
Anne will correct all of my mistakes in a few weeks.
The child, and then you feel like he's like, when you stop feeling mean.
Yeah, I mean, those are good internal indicators that something's going the right direction.
That breaks it down.
Right, even if the kid still isn't reading, even if, you know, even if they're still poking their neighbor more than you want them to.
Okay, so I don't want to hug the mic. I see another question, but real quick. So it really, it goes with, I heard about the initiative in New York City, for example, where the first lady mayor has got this whole initiative on mental health. And so there's mental health first aid classes. So is there mental health first aid for us, for children?
There should be. Call Washburn.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, there should. And the thing is that we know the younger you go, it's about, again, mental health is relationships, right? It's really hard to talk about a baby with a mental health problem. It's a relationship that has, where the combined interaction between parent and child. So oftentimes the mental health problem of the child is like the canary in the coal mine saying things aren't going right, right? And the child is just fine. They're doing what they're supposed to do. They're showing you as the canary in the coal mine that they need help, that this is not right for me. And, you know, that's actually a good thing. Then everybody runs around and goes, there's something wrong with this child. And then they get to Washburn, and then things happen.
As I'm walking the mic up, I'll just mention quickly, mental health first aid training is really expanding dramatically across the country, and it is available for teachers, for people in all related fields. You also brought up a very important point. We did a study of outcomes at Washburn from Parents Report looking at over 5 years worth of client data, and it found exactly what Dr. Gunnar just talked about. When children came in, their parents reported their behavior and emotional development was at a certain level. After some time in treatment, their functioning and their behavior actually got worse.
Yeah.
And it was only by staying with it and really sticking it out and working through it, then they made dramatic progress. But you had to stick it out and stay with it, and the kids do get worse before they get better.
Sure. If you learn to play piano and you don't hold your hands right, and that's become the way you're supposed to play, you can sound reasonably decent. And then you get to a teacher and they try to change you, and for a while your playing goes in the tubes. Poof! But then it gets better because you're finally holding your hands right. So it's really like muscles and neural patterns. Disrupt them, and for a while, performance gets worse.
Dr. Gunnar, first of all, thank you. That was an absolutely wonderful lecture. I've no doubt, but that's not the first time you've heard that comment. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, what is the state of the art as regards, functional brain imaging? Do we know, and thinking of, is the plasticity measurable by modern functional brain imaging techniques, or where is the future in that regard?
So you all in Minnesota should be exceptionally proud that you are Minnesotans for many, many reasons. But one of the big initiatives that's going on is called the Human Connectome Project. It's not only what regions you have in the brain, but how they get connected up. That is critically important to how they work, right? A big push is called this Human Connectome Project that is being done at the University of Minnesota and Washington University are the two big hubs, and then University of North Carolina, and there's some folks out in California as well. So we are a big site for testing thousands of individuals. It first came up as an adult, looking at adults, looking at how the brain is connected in adults. Then they got a developmental one that got 5-year-olds to adults in. And now we have the baby connectome out of the Institute of Child Development. So the brain is being mapped across development to look at how these connections develop. Those are going to be the more plastic things, right? The size of, is it bigger or smaller, but really how is it being connected up? And when we repair, are the connections changing? And that's going to help us in the long run. The brain is just this wondrous organism. Imaging is helpful, but it's really, we're not at the level of the individual cell so all of the work that I'm talking about requires people, I talk about them as human people, monkey people, and rat people, and probably fruit fly people, getting together, and much of this is happening in creating these research networks where we can share up and down the levels of analysis and try to, to make this actually really be meaningful. It's an area, this whole area has exploded, and I'm sorry, many of us will be long since bye-bye by the time we're able to use some of the information the most therapeutically. But when you think about the fact that it's really been only about 15, 20 years of any kind of imaging, it's remarkable where we're getting. We also at the university have the most sophisticated imaging facilities in the world. It's the CMRR, the Center for Magnetic Resonance Research. We've got more magnets, and we've got magnets that can do some really high, that you would never put a human in, really intense magnification. So anyways, we've really got a tremendous resource here for studying brains. Yeah.
I'm working at a school with first graders.
Yep.
And it's a wonderful school with a lot of resources. The free and reduced lunch is at 93%, and the homeless and highly mobile is at roughly 24%.
Where are you?
Hall on the north side.
North side, yep.
And I don't know which of these two things to say first, but one is that I think the single biggest eye-opening thing that's happened since I went there is that I have been kind of amazed at the high proportion of parents that I talk to who are really supportive and really, are working really hard to make things right for their kids in school. So that's...
Every teacher knows that's a lot of the battle.
Yeah, and I think, thank heavens, because I feel like in relation to what you're talking about, the prefrontal cortex development, and I go back to the ACEs study and the adverse childhood experiences stuff, and I feel like every day I am seeing a ton of, volatile, overreactive, very, fear.
Right.
So two questions. One is, how do I not get discouraged, because they're 6, 7 years old, and the ideal time to work on this has passed.
Oh, no.
Okay.
There's still loads of plasticity.
Oh, yeah. No, I know.
Okay.
But I understand what I'm saying. And the other is, sometimes I get discouraged and frustrated because I think there is so much emphasis on, with the achievement gap, on this is about institutional racism. And I think an awful lot of it is about, there's a high correlation between all those adverse childhood experiences and, children of color. It shouldn't be that way, but that's how it is. And how do we get the focus? In my mind, we need to get the focus onto all the variables that contribute.
Okay, you're asking me to go political here, and I will. So, institutional racism, really a horrible problem. It's a population-level problem that we need to address at a population level. We need to change the way we treat people, right? You're working with a kid who's had certain experiences, and saying that it's institutional, it ain't going to help that kid much, right? Unless we can change the world, in which case they won't have to walk out into a world, right? So what you want to do with that kid is try to establish that safe relationship if you can. How do you keep doing that when you've got a room full of kids that we need to provide teachers with way more support than we do. We put our dollars sort of in the wrong places, like prisons, instead of teachers. But that's my political argument for the evening. Anybody else got anything they want to say before I get myself in trouble with politics?
I think we have time for one final question, and then we're going to wrap up. Yeah.
The therapeutic and what you keep saying is that consistency. You get so frustrated, but
Yes.
you can stay consistent. Like they teach us all the time, the first affect to regulate is your own. So the minute you can take a breath and model that and provide that consistent experience, whether it is in your home, wherever it is, the therapeutic setting, it just helps, again, do that, what I think is the infinity symbol, right? That serve and return is going back and forth. So I just wanted to add that to your piece.
Well, yeah, and there are strategies. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is pretty good, and things of that sort.
All right, one more question.
One more question.
I promise I even wrote it down. Okay. So thinking about risk and resilience factors.
Yes.
I'm curious to hear your expertise on what your thoughts are on educating adolescents and older students about their experiences and using them as like a strengths approach and discussing how, yes, in this classroom, it might be something that you feel you get a consequence for, but in the world, this is how this can help you. And also teaching regulation and all the good things. But what are your thoughts, or do you have any information on the strengths and protective factors that also could be seen as risks?
That could also be seen as risks. Well, the problem with risk and resilience is one end is one end and the other end is the resilience end. So sometimes it's hard to know which you're looking at. I would probably turn to things that are being done by the Search Institute. They've done wonderful things. They've got great stuff out on adolescence. So they're the ones that would actually have like a nicely organized evidence-based answer. I will give you the answer that is not evidence-based, it's my personal opinion, that adolescents want to be respected, and that they are very, very good at recognizing when we don't respect them. And there's ways of saying, in my classroom we don't do this, but not because you're a jerk, but this is, treating them with respect as partners. That's the challenge. The problem with adolescents is oftentimes we have to remove the scaffolding because they're adolescents, but they are still needing scaffolding. So how do you scaffold somebody who needs scaffolding without making them feel like you're treating them like a baby? Great challenge. I don't teach adolescents. I had to at one time, and it was the challenge. Oh, the Search Institute here. Fabulous place. They have, just go on the web, the Search Institute. They've just got tons, and they've been doing loads of work on adolescence and resilience. Exactly, precisely. Really good stuff.
Can we say one more huge thank you to Dr. Megan Gunnar?
Thank you, thank you.
And if you will stay with me, I promise just for 2 more minutes, there are a couple other events similar to this coming up that I wanted to share, and then also 2 huge thank yous that I want to make to the people who made tonight possible. I hope that this will be the first of many times that you will join us. I mentioned that this is the second event in a 4-part series, and Dr. Ann Garrity, who's right back there, will be doing one of the presentations in our series coming up. Ann is an incredible speaker. She was an extraordinary mentor to me, who I'm really grateful for. If you have the chance, come back and see Ann. That's all I'm going to say. We have another session with Dr. Bill Allen. That will be another session in this series. In addition to that, and picking up more on the topic that we talked about, one article that I would recommend if you're interested in understanding and diving into more the impact of understanding institutional racism on and how it connects with trauma. Dr. Ken Hardy, who is a speaker who's been to town a couple times, has written some extraordinary books, and one article in particular is called Shifting the Burden and Understanding the Impact of Racial Trauma. So along with that, we are also starting off just in 2 weeks a new series that we've developed in partnership with the Stanton Adams Diversity Institute that's called Let's Talk About Race, Equity, and Access. So that will be diving into both better understanding the impact of everything that we're the impact of disparities, inequities, and institutional racism. This session is going to dive really into practical discussion about what can we do. We need to understand the problem, but we also need to really understand what we can do to make an impact. That session is going to do that. There will be 2 more sessions in that series coming up later this year as well. On February 21st, if you want to learn more about Washburn, come back for a free luncheon and tour. Our training institute has a whole range of events, and I have to flip to the second page here so I don't forget everything. On Washburn's website, there's a training institute page you can go to. There are dozens of trainings throughout the year that we'll also be hosting in addition to this one. The last training I have to mention as well is Washburn is also starting a new partnership we're excited about with the Westminster Town Hall Forum. And coming up in March, we will be having a first session with Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. If you have a chance to check out her TED Talk, it is extraordinary because she talks about the impact of adverse childhood experiences, but she took that work and established a center in Oakland that is doing direct healthcare advocacy and training. She is a phenomenal speaker. So that will be another event coming up. And then I want to say a huge thank you to the folks who made tonight possible. So Leslie and Stuart Crosby. Leslie is here somewhere. Leslie's in the back. A huge, huge thank you to Leslie Crosby. And to Brent Marmo from Agency Squid. They have been the sponsors for this series. This kind of training and the services that we provide are simply not possible without philanthropic support. And it was really both their support but also their vision and commitment to making this happen that made it possible. So a huge thank you to them. Thank you for showing up tonight, and please come back. Good night.